Okay, so popular YouTubers Rhett and Link recently made a big deal of what they call deconstructing their faith. And so basically they left the Christian faith. They are longtime Christians, grew up immersed in Southern Christian culture, growing up together as friends, and became successful sort of comedy YouTubers, and left the faith. So anytime there's somebody with anyone really, but especially high profile people that have this sort of a story, we want to dive into it because we're Christians, and so we want to see what are the dangers out there, right, for that are causing people to stumble. So Goins Phillips, Faithwire editor, joining us here. And Trey, you wrote about this and kind of dove into the topic. Neither one of us really follow these guys that much, so this was sort of our first foray into these two. So what were your first impressions, and like maybe start with some of the reasons they gave, and then we can kind of break them down one by one.
Yeah. So my first impression was that they're definitely following the direction, I think, of the millennial generation, of my generation, which is that there's nothing higher than my feelings or my experiences, that there's no amount of research, no amount of data, no amount of counter information that can top whatever my feelings are, my experiences are. It seems to me that that's just, I think, become an idol of our generation. That we use as an out for anything when something becomes difficult. Say, well, these are my feelings.
Yeah.
And this is what I've experienced. And it seems to be, and I'm not trying to downgrade. I'm sure this was a difficult process for both of them, both Rhett and Link.
Yeah, and I'll just stop you there. I just want to stop you there real quick, Trey. I will say I appreciated the fact that they were willing to sort of bare their souls a little bit. I mean, they didn't have to do this.
Yeah.
So I did appreciate that they kind of provided this window in the soul. Like, I feel like I knew these guys after watching them each for an hour or so discuss their faith journeys and then ultimately leaving the faith. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, a lot of it, though, seems to really hinge on their feelings, and maybe the difficulty they've had, or the cognitive dissonance, I guess, between what Scripture says, what they were raised and taught to believe, and what they're now faced with living in LA and being immersed in YouTube and entertainment culture. And like a lot of it seems to be, from what I've listened to and the interviews I've watched over the last day or so, seems to hinge on the LGBT issue, which I understand is like that's the issue, I think, of our day right now. So it's not surprising that'd be an issue. Like there's at one point in one interview, Rhett said, no one except a French cult is going to be anti-LGBT in 100 years. And they said eventually the church says, okay, we're going to incorporate that too, because if we don't, we're going to die. And then he said later, if something is true, it should be able to withstand investigation and inquiry. And my first thought was, one, those two things are really feelings based and your experience based. Like it dismisses the fact that the church has been around for thousands of years, and the fact that it's still thriving and growing and is the world's largest religion. Obviously, it stood up to some inquiry and it stood up to some challenges.
Right.
Well,
and the Bible
just seems short-sighted.
Yeah, and the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. So anytime we come across these arguments, like, it's great for us to try to study them and repeat them and rehash them and say them so that we can better understand them ourselves. But we have to understand that we're not the first people to grapple with these sorts of questions. So you're not going, no matter what, sort of position you arrive at, you can't have this posture that, well, I have found the nuclear option that just totally nukes this worldview or that worldview, because everybody's got an answer, for all of these claims. Now you can debate the how good of an argument each one of these are as comebacks, and the validity of each one of those and how well they stand up. And that's why people fall on different sides of the aisle. And that's why I fall as a Christian, because I don't find the atheist / agnostic, answers to these questions to be very compelling. But obviously a lot of people do, and they don't find the answers to the difficult questions for Christianity compelling. But Trey, I want to read your, because to your point there about the feelings thing, I wanted to read your opening line because I really like the way you worded this. You wrote, "That's my experience. It's the impenetrable wall of the millennial generation. There's no acceptable response outside of total affirmation to that 3-word phrase, a death knell to any sort of conversation and absolute truths." And I thought that was really well put, because that is true. What happens now? You just say that's my truth, or those are my feelings, and then that's that. And look what that's leading to today.
Yeah. And I think so. You mentioned that there's nothing, the scripture that talks about how there's nothing new under the sun. And to put a positive spin on that, like I think that's like my opening line. That's what our generation has done with experiences. But I think to put a positive spin on it as believers, we can say, okay, there is nothing new under the sun. I can look at the Old Testament and see the sexual immorality they lived in. I can look through the Gospels and see all the things that Paul wrote about avoiding sexual immorality and staying away from sexually immoral situations. So there, like none of the stuff that we're facing today, it might seem overwhelming and it might be a lot. But as a believer, I think we should take comfort to know that it's not new. This isn't like, it's not like God was all of a sudden blindsided by the fact that people are struggling with their sexual orientation, or that some people have gender dysphoria. Like this, none of this is brand new, and it's been around for years and years and years. And I think if nothing else, this sparks a conversation. Rhett and Link situation sparks a conversation about, okay, what is just my experience, and what's just overwhelming me as my experience, and what's an actual legitimate challenge to the faith. And I think it would be short-sighted and a little bit, I don't know, prideful to think that my experience is somehow new and has never existed before, and how all of a sudden my questions are the big questions that are gonna be the final nail on the coffin to end Christianity.
Well, yeah, and another interesting thing because there were a few red flags. There was an article we saw by a friend of theirs that we read, a former friend, who kind of pointed out some of these red flags, and kind of to your point there that you just made about the 100 years and the sexuality thing, and like that's not a good, if you really think about that. Well, in 100 years, nobody's going to be believing that anymore. Well, the everybody's doing it, argument is really not a compelling argument to believe something, right? Like to say, well, Christianity is not true because, geez, everyone's believing this now. Like, well, that's not a very compelling argument. And so to me, when because he seemed to have this pattern, Trey, let's see if you noticed this too, but he seemed to have this pattern of sort of dismissing any critiques that were sort of inbound, and then just saying, well, yeah, I've already read all that stuff, and that's just kind of hogwash. But here's this incredible atheist argument. So to me, I thought the claims of we're just pursuing truth and whatever's true is fine, like seemed a little bit disingenuous to me, especially when he said things like, well, that ship sailed on the old Earth versus young Earth thing. It's like, well, there are definitely secular scientists, and most of culture and secular culture believe that, but that's not something that can really ever be possibly settled scientists. I'm not a scientist. I've watched a lot of these debates, and I know that there are people on both sides, both Christians and non-Christians. But the point is, those are things that there are competing views on. There are a lot of brilliant scientists who believe the Earth is younger. So you can't tell me that this is a dumb view and the ship has sailed when there are brilliant people who also believe it. So anyway, the point is, like, is it really a search for truth, or is this something else?
Yeah, so an analogy that I've been thinking of the last 24 hours or so, I think, is that of like a speed limit and being safe when we're driving. If my motivation is purely external, just, okay, the only reason I follow the speed limit is because there's a cop around the corner that could catch me, or there's a bunch of signs that just continue to tell me that 45 is the speed limit, then I'll go the speed limit. But then when the situation changes, when there's no speed limit signs and there are no cops around, what do I do? I'm like, okay, now if my motivation is only to follow the rules that are in place, then I could do anything. There's no motivation internally anymore. But if my motivation is internal, like if I'm motivated to stay safe, and because my motivation is to stay safe, then I do follow the speed limit signs. Then when my situation and circumstance changes, I still have that internal compass of I want to keep myself and those around me and those in my vehicle safe. Then I'm still going to be a responsible driver with or without those external forces. And I think that's probably kind of, that's dumbing it down, but I think that's to an extent what might have happened with Rhett and Link, where they grew up in a Bible Belt culture, and they grew up where there were all of these rules, and the rules just had the name Christianity associated to it. And then when they stepped out of that culture, whether it was before they left North Carolina and moved to LA or not, when they stepped out of that culture and stopped surrounding themselves by that society and that community, I think a lot of that started to fall away because their motivation wasn't internal. Their motivation was external. It was to follow rules and to follow societal norms.
Yeah.
So I think if that's if that's the only motivation, when people start challenging it and poking holes in it, it's hard to stand up on it. And I sympathize with that, because I think we all do that to a certain degree, or we're all at least tempted maybe to do that, to conflate our culture with our religion.
Yeah.
So.
No, 100%. And you know, I think that cultural Christianity is just as dangerous, I think, in a lot of ways as, you know, just straight up flagrant unbelieving, because you know, you end up having more damaging, you know, view of believers and belief and religion and everything else. But I think it kind of highlights the need that we have, as you were saying, not just to make it some external thing that everybody does, and a set of rules to follow, but to really try to, you know, imprint, especially, you know, me as a parent, like looking at how do I teach my kids. And, you know, ultimately it's the grace of God. And so, you know, we're just praying that, you know, God is is gracious with our children. But, you know, because at the end of the day, it's not me or my wife who saved my kids. But to your point, we're trying to teach them, you know, that this is a relational thing with God, and it's not just rules that he wants you to follow. And, you know, going deeper with that and saying, well, this is real. The Bible is real. And so what are the implications of that if the Bible is real? And and like you said, it's a desire to be obedient, right? Like if we want to please God, we're going to do the things he says, you know, and it's not because, oh, we better do all these things or else lightning bolts are going to come down from the sky. It's a relationship thing, because we love God and that we want to do things that he knows that are best for us. So you're right. Like, I mean, it just, like, again, we don't know these guys other than from what they shared on their videos, but it does seem like that was their relationship with Christianity. And so when these other things were brought up to him, as you said, you know, they just kind of were swayed by them. And so, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, we'll see. Maybe in 10 years, you know, I'm going to be, you know, mourning all of these, you know, sorry, phone ringing there, of course, in the middle of the segment. But, you know, maybe my kids will be struggling with their faith. I don't know. I have no idea how that's going to play out. I pray that's not the case. But, you know, but ultimately it's God's grace in that situation. So.
Yeah, I think like a final thought that maybe can end this on an encouraging note is, I say this, you should still investigate your faith and ask tough questions. If you've got tough questions, don't hold them back because you're scared of the answers. I don't think that's what either of us are saying here. I think it's important to challenge your faith, because that's how we shore it up, and that's how, you know, iron sharpens iron. We have tough discussions and we grow that way. But I think something that I've taken comfort in over the years, and something that maybe some of our viewers can take comfort in, is if we're trusting in Jesus and we build out our faith from there, we build out our worldview from the grace of Christ, then we don't really have anything to prove. And I ended the article that I wrote this way. I said, we don't need to be prepared to have the best argument or to prove something because we have nothing to prove. Instead, we should focus on making sure our worldviews are built around Jesus rather than fitting Jesus into our worldviews. And I said, if we don't center our faith on Christ, there's a good chance we could all go the way of Rhett and Link. So they're human, and the reality is their journey is not really unfamiliar to a lot of people, and it's the direction that any of us could go at any moment if we take our eyes off Christ.
And I just want to that's a great point, and I want to tag team on that one about pursuing the difficult questions, because I think you're 100% right, and I think it's actually, because I think a tendency for a lot of Christians, it's uncomfortable. Like, we were doing a Bible study with our kids, and, you know, my kids are from age 4 to almost 15 now. And, you know, we were talking about the Amalekites, and when God goes in and wipes them all out, and it's like, you know, it says very clearly in the Bible, the women and the children as well, all of them. Right. And so that's an uncomfortable passage. And so I think the easy thing to do is just go, well, we're just going to talk about, well, the nice parts, the red letters that Jesus, when he says nice things, and even all of Jesus's red letters aren't always comfortable. But, you know, we tend to focus on those because that's the easy thing. But I liked having that conversation because it pushed me to really investigate, you know, God. And so, you know, we can talk about God's sovereignty, and we can talk about how that all makes sense in a worldview that puts God at the center, and how those things don't make sense. You know, you can show the folly of the other worldviews of atheism when you have to look at those things. You can say, well, why is that wrong in an atheist worldview? And you really have no foundation to put that on. So I think I would encourage you to investigate those questions, because you're right. We have nothing. Christianity has the best answers to those questions. We have a fully coherent worldview, and where everyone has difficult aspects, I think the Christian one has the best answers for those. So, all right, cool. Well, great stuff. Great article, Trey. I encourage everyone to read it over on faithwire.com. And thanks for being here.